Well, good morning, everyone. Glad to see everyone here survive the Christmas season. It's a good season. I love Christmas. One of my favorite things about Christmas is not the season or, the stuff that's going on. But my favorite thing about it is their traditions. And the more you get to know families, like each family has their own traditions that they have during Christmas, which really makes it special to learn about those traditions. So I'm going to tell you about some of my family traditions that we had during Christmas and how one of them ties into our story today. So a couple of them, involve the movies we watch. Like we usually try to watch It's a Wonderful Life or White Christmas or Holiday Inn or The Grinch. Those kind of movies. My family loves them. We also have traditions of on the day after Thanksgiving when we decorate, set up for Christmas. For a couple of years, we had a tradition of going up to the Minneapolis St. Paul and going to a thing called the Holidazzle Parade, which is a nighttime parade in downtown Minneapolis where they had all the floats were covered in Christmas lights. It was a lot of fun. One of my favorite traditions that stood out to me was a game we played. And the game was called Hide the Wise Men. So when it came to Christmas, we'd do our nativity scene a little differently. We'd have, the baby Jesus, Mary, Joseph would be there. We'd have the shepherds, some of the animals in the manger scene. We'd also have an angel. But we'd take the wise men, we do something different with them. And what we do with the wise men is we take them and hide them around our house. So we take them and hide them in different spots around the house. Now, it's not the type of hidden where you're trying to keep it hidden forever. It's the kind of hidden you put someplace where somebody will probably find it, or you hope somebody will find it. Because the game is you'd hide a wise man, but then if you found a wise man, you'd have to hide that wise man then too. So we do this tradition of just hiding the wise men around our house, and they'd end up all over the place. You'd open up the fridge, and there'd be a wise man staring out at you. You get a cup out of the cabinet, and there'd be a wise man sitting down in there. You go to grab a remote, and there's a wise man sitting on the remote. They'd end up all over the house. And sometimes they'd be hidden for months, and we'd find them, in April or March or sometime, just find them laying around somewhere because they were hidden so well. But this is one tradition that I love, and I love it for another reason is because it involves the wise men. And the wise men are some minor characters in the Bible that we don't often get to talk about, and we don't properly look at. And I think there's some misconceptions about them we need to correct. Because the wise men actually have a very important role in the story of God, in the story of the Bible. And they have a really interesting story, and I think we need to flesh it out and give them the credit they're due. Give them their own story. Give them their own time. Because a lot of times we just kind of bulk in the wise men story with the nativity story, to add the wise men to the nativity scene. They get thrown in there, but we don't really get to see their whole story. So what I want to do is kind of correct some of these misconceptions and look at the wise men as a people who show us how to worship and what worship looks like. And to do this, we're going to be in the book of Matthew in chapter 2, verses 1 through 23. And Matthew is the only person to count the wise men's story, and it's a short story, only 23 verses, but it's a beautiful story, I think, that tells about the wise men, but also tells about some of the implications that the wise men brought about, what they're coming to see Jesus actually did. So, if you don't mind, we're going to start, and I'll read from the beginning to the end. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler, and will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went back to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, having been warned in a dream. He withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. And so was fulfilled that what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So this is a great story, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. And we need to start kind of looking at who's in this story and we need to identify them. So the first thing we see is the wise men, which in the wise men, there's some translations that put magi there or wise men. But we don't get a head count here. The only thing we know is that it's plural. So we could guess there's more than two. Most people assume there was three because there's three gifts, but there could have been, a dozen of them or a good amount of them. We don't know, but there was multiple wise men. We also know that these men were wise men, not kings. There's a lot of people believe that they were kings that came to worship Jesus, but they were actually just wise men. Because the word there, magi, just means wise men. And they just study the Jewish texts. And we're going to look at a little bit later how they got these Jewish texts, but what they're seeing here is something from Isaiah 60, which in Isaiah 60, it talks about a star and a king being born. And it even talks about the gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh being brought. So these must have been men who studied the scriptures, knew the Old Testament scriptures, saw these signs, and realized these two must connect. So they went to worship him. And like I said earlier, this is a story we often forget in the Bible because we just kind of tack on the wise men. When the shepherds came, we think Mary and Joseph, Jesus was born, the shepherds came, and the wise men came. But that's not true. So the wise men did not show up the night Jesus was born. They came later on. They didn't come until Jesus was a few months old, maybe even a year and a half. It's believed he was probably about a year and a half old. And because we know this, because Jesus wasn't born, he was not in the same place where he was born. Mary and Joseph had their own place now, which I always thought was interesting and would like to know why. Like, why did Mary and Joseph stay living in Bethlehem? Maybe Joseph got a job opportunity there and decided to stay there. But they stayed and started a life. And the wise men started their journey after Jesus was born, because the star appeared after Jesus was born. So for them to get there would have taken a while. And this is the reason why my family hid the wise men. Because at the nativity scene, the wise men weren't there yet. They were on the way. So we hid them around the house to symbolize that they were on the way to the nativity scene. Because they were making their way to Bethlehem. They were going to take them a while, but they would eventually get there. And this is, something, if you have a nativity scene set up in your yard, there's an easy fix for that. Those nice light-up ones. Just put the nativity scene on one side of the yard and put the wise men on the other side of the yard and put up a sign that says, "In transit." And then, people know they're making their way there. They're going to get there late, but they'll get there. So those are some of the main misconceptions about the wise men, that we don't know how many there are. They were wise men, and they got there late. I wanted to clarify them because the answer is right there in the Bible, and sometimes we forget to look at that and see that. But when we get to this story, I want to talk about this story because what happens in this gospel account of the wise men is a lot of things. It shows us what they brought, what those gifts meant, and how we are to worship them, and how we are to respond to the arrival of Jesus. So the story of the wise men is simply put a story about people traveling to worship God, to worship the Christ. And we see this happen all throughout the Bible. People travel to worship places. People travel to Jerusalem to worship there, to worship the temple. People from foreign countries who travel to Jerusalem. People nowadays take pilgrimages to worship at certain places because there's something significant about a place and going to worship there. The wise men were simply coming to Israel to worship the Christ. So we see that these men journey, but we need to know where they journeyed from. So there's lots of theories about where they journeyed from. We know that they came from the east, came from somewhere off in Asia. We don't know where. There are some theories that they could have been descendants of Jews who remained in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity, which took place in 586 to 538 BC. This could explain why they had Jewish texts, why they had the scrolls, why they understood Isaiah, because those texts were left there and brought there when Israelites were taken captive back to Babylon. It also makes sense because the word magi is a Persian word. And so they're probably from that Persia area. And what we're going to do, just to simplify it, is to say they're from Babylon. So the journey from Babylon to Jerusalem is about 1,000 miles, which is a long way even in today's standards. But in today's standards, you can travel 1,000 miles in a day if you get a plane, in a couple days if you get a car. But these men didn't have a car or a plane. They had 2 feet and camels, and that's how they would travel. So this is a long trek. This is not like, we're going to drive up to Grandma's house for the day and come back. We're making a journey across the country, across the desert to see a Christ. So this journey, it would have taken a long time. It probably would have taken them months, maybe even years to do this journey, to come. And this is this long journey. We have to remember what they're using to guide them. They're not using a GPS or a map. They're using a star. Now, I lived out in the country, and the only time, and it's dark there at night, but the only time you can see stars is at night. So if they're being guided by a star, they have to be traveling at night. So imagine walking through the desert, 1,000 miles at night. That's going to take a long time. It's going to be a long journey. And especially at night, when it's so dark all around, you're trying to have some light so you can see around you, but not having it too bright so you don't see the stars. It would have been a time-consuming journey. But the thing the wise men see is they see what's at the end of this journey. They see what they're going for. They see that they're going to worship the king of the Messiah, the king. And that's worth it. They're willing to go through all these hoops, go through this long, crazy, incredulous journey just to worship this king. Because the prize at the end was worth the troubles and trials to go through the journey. So the wise men, they didn't know where to go, so they figured, if the king of the Jews will go to Jerusalem. So they start walking around the city of Jerusalem asking, where is the newborn king of the Jews? Which we kind of don't have this because we don't have kings. But walking around a town with another king asking where the new king is not something people really like. And Herod was upset by this because Herod was the king. Herod was the king who had been put there by Caesar Augustus, and he was the king of the Jews. Even though he wasn't a Jew, even though the Jews didn't like him, he was still the king. So having these men proclaim, where is the new king, Herod would have been a little bit upset because a new king is a threat to his throne. And Herod is not a very nice guy. If you know anything about the Bible, he did some good things. He built a lot of good buildings and roads and stuff, did some good stuff. But he also did some bad things. He switched sides. He used to be on Cleopatra and Mark Antony's side, but then he joined Caesar Augustus once Cleopatra and Mark Antony left. He killed his own sons, who he did not think were fit to rule the throne. He even killed his wife when he thought he might be killed so she wouldn't become queen. He locked up people, murdered them for no reason because he was the king. So any little threat to his throne, he would take action. So he thinks, there's a newborn king, well, I got to kill him. I got to get rid of that threat. So Herod comes to the wise men saying, you know what, I'll help you guys out, and you guys can help me out. I'll help you guys out because I want to worship this king too. So Herod asks them to seek out this king and helps them seek out this king. That is where they're directed to Bethlehem, and they go and they find Jesus. So after they find Jesus, they worship him. So they travel south. They missed the mark by about 10 miles, but they travel south and they find Jesus. And it says they worship him. So this is one of those misconceptions, another one that we have because of the way words are. When we hear worship, we think singing songs. But when it says they worshiped him, they didn't just sing songs. They most likely bowed down, got on their hands and knees, and bowed down and worshipped this Messiah. So Jesus at this time was most likely probably a year and a half old. So he's a little toddler. So imagine a little toddler walking around, crawling around, and men come down and bow down on their hands and knees and worship him. And that is what worship is. And when they worshiped him, what they did is they saw who he was and recognized who he truly was. They had awe and reverence for who this baby was. Even though this baby, this infant, was a child, he hadn't done anything yet to be worthy of that awe and reverence. They still knew that this child, this was someone to be revered. This is the king of the Jews. And the thing we see here is a choice. They chose to worship Jesus. They chose. They weren't invited. The shepherds were invited into this story. The wise men jumped into the story. They weren't invited. They just showed up. They're like, we want to be a part of this story. We want to worship this king. And they showed up. And the same choice that the wise men presented is the same one we're presented. We have this choice to worship Jesus. We have the choice to come to worship him. We have the choice to participate in this. And I think it's really interesting looking at this. The desire they had to come and see Jesus is one, I don't know a lot of people who have that kind of desire these days. What kind of desire do we have to travel 1,000 miles across a desert to worship a king? But then looking at it, I've done some things like that. I've driven across country to go to concerts. I've driven across states, to go to soccer games, late nights up in the car, driving back to get back. I've driven long road trips to get home, all because it was worth it. The thing I was going to was worth it to me. The thing I was seeking was worth the long journey. It was worth the trouble. It was worth the sitting in a car for 18 hours. It was worth all that because what I was going for was something I valued. And the wise men see that. They value what they were going to worship. And no distance, no obstacle could stand in their way of going there. And that's something I wonder is do we have that same desire in our heart? Do we have that same desire to not let anything stand in our way to come and worship God? Because a lot of times we think of really good excuses to not come to worship God or to, maybe not go to church today. But these wise men, they didn't let any excuse stand in their way. They said, if there's an excuse, we're going to go through it. We're going to go around it. And it reminded me of an old song that I really like, and it says, ain't no mountain high, ain't no valley low, ain't no river wide enough. And that song's about love, but I think it applies to worship too. These wise men, I think they were thinking that when they were making this trek across the desert. Nothing can stand in our way. We're going to see the King of the Jews. We're going there. Nothing's going to stand in our way. And the thing I love more about this is that, look at this story. It says they worshiped Jesus and then they left. So they were probably in Bethlehem only for like one day maybe, not even a day. They were there for a very short time. And they turned and they left. Which is amazing. They spent months journeying to see this son, to see this king. And they just turn around and leave at the end of it. If we make a journey somewhere, a trip somewhere, we want to make the trip worth it, right? You got to stay a certain amount of days, do X, Y, Z to make a trip worth it, And I'd always when I'd go home, it'd take 4 days to travel home and back. So I'd have to justify, if I'm traveling 4 days to get home and back, I need to be home for at least 4 days to make it worth it. But these wise men, they traveled months to celebrate a king for one day, which I think is crazy. Something we kind of overlook looking at the Bible. They weren't there for a whole long, but they worshipped him and they enjoyed it and they made that little bit worth it. And it also says they brought gifts. And there's 3 gifts they brought, and these gifts were gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And these gifts do have a tie to the Old Testament. Like I said, that Isaiah passage has a mention of some gifts to bring to the king. But these gifts also have some significance. Gold is a kingly gift. If you were to go to a king and give him a gift, the gift you'd probably give him is gold. Because kings liked gold. We always have the images of kings having their big rooms of gold. Gold would give the king power. Gold would give the king wealth. And that's what the kings wanted, is power and wealth. So if you give the king gold, that means you're giving him power and wealth and respect for his power and wealth. The next thing we see given is frankincense. Which frankincense was an incense. And what incense was used for was you burn it and it'd leave a nice pleasing aroma. A lot of old cultures would do this in their temples. They'd burn incense in their temples to their gods for a pleasing aroma. The Jews did this in the tabernacle and the temple as well, burned incenses to leave a pleasing aroma. We do that with candles nowadays to have a pleasing aroma. But frankincense is one of these incenses used in worship. You'd use it to worship gods, usually to worship deities. And the third thing we see there is myrrh. And myrrh was perfume. And it was simply used to put on dead bodies. During the process of when they're putting the bodies away into the graves, dead bodies, they would embalm them, use the different spices and perfumes to make the bodies not smell so bad. So we see in those 3 gifts the 3 things Jesus is going to be. The wise men are foretelling what Christ will be, based on these old texts that say what Christ will be, but they're also saying this is what Christ will be, and they don't know what he's going to be yet. They just give him these gifts to say, this is what we're bringing to show value to him. It was gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And a lot of times when we think of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, we think, they're a little bit, like a little box or something. But I don't think there was. I think there were probably chests of it, a chest of gold, a chest of frankincense, a chest of myrrh. Because not only were these kingly gifts, but they were given in a kingly amount, I believe, to a king. Because if they wanted to truly show the worship to the king, if you showed up to a king and offered 1 gold coin as payment, that wouldn't really be a kingly gift. It'd be a kingly gift choice, but not a kingly gift. So I believe they gave chest of gold, chest of frankincense, chest of myrrh to show a great wealth, a great value. And not only that, but these gifts would have cost them a lot of money. And carrying these gifts across the desert would have been time-consuming and a lot of work. But it was worth it because they were giving something valuable to someone of more value. So this is the end of the wise men's stories. They show up, they bring gifts, they worship, and they leave. Sure, they show up a little bit late, but they're not even in the story that long. And they don't go back to Herod. An angel warns them, don't go to Herod, he's bad news, flee. So Herod realizes after a little while he's been duped. He realizes, you know what, they tricked me. So Herod thinks, well, there's still a potential king in Bethlehem, and I have to strike out at him. And Herod learned from the wise men that the star appeared about 2 years ago. So Herod strikes out at Bethlehem and commits mass murder to all the under 2-year-old men in the town of Bethlehem. See, he's willing to commit mass murder to protect his throne. He's willing to kill people to protect his throne, to keep himself on the throne. And Mary and Joseph then have to flee to Egypt. They have to flee and run for their lives in order to protect Jesus. And in all reality, the gifts that the wise men had given them were most likely used to help them fund passage to Egypt, to help them start a life in Egypt, or to keep, stay out of trouble in Egypt and stay alive. Which I think is a crazy thing, that they come, they get these expensive gifts, all this worship, and then they have to flee immediately. They see people recognize their son is the king, but then they have to flee for their lives as refugees. And then a few years later, in 4 BC, Herod dies. And Mary and Joseph return to Nazareth. And then that's the end of little Jesus. Then we flash forward, and Jesus is there as an adult. But the story is great and has a lot of stuff in it. And it really is about us seeking out Jesus in life and worshiping him. The more I thought about it, the more I looked at the story, I thought, this story is about worship and how we can choose to seek out God in worship or how we can choose to reject him. And it's kind of these two ways we can choose, because Jesus, when he comes into the world, stuff happens. And when Jesus comes into your life, stuff is going to happen. You're going to have a choice to make. You can either react to Jesus' arrival by worshiping him, giving him valuable gifts, giving him your life, laying down any burden and obstacle to come to him, or you can seek to keep yourself the king. Because in this story, we have two people who are kings. We have baby King Jesus, and we have King Herod. The wise men come to Jesus and recognize him as the true king. King Herod can't recognize another king. He can only recognize himself as king and will do whatever he can to keep himself on the throne. And this is kind of what it is in worship. Worship is simply recognizing God for who he is and who Jesus is, and recognizing that he is the king, he is on the throne, and I cannot be on the throne. Because Jesus is the king recognized by the signs. And so the wise men, what they did is they went out of their way to recognize Jesus as the king. They went out of their way to show and recognize Jesus as the king. But King Herod, he was willing to go out of his way to only keep himself as the throne. Because the thing is, God made Jesus the king of the world. No matter what we try to do, no matter how we try to hold on to our power, how we try to hold on to our own kingship, God can take that away. And God can undo that. And if we try to undo the kingship that God has put in place, then God can still work in that. God can still work through our holding on to our kingship. And when we worship him, what we need to do is give him all we have. Give Jesus all we have. Give him the valuable gifts. A lot of people think we just to sing, but we have to give him more. We have to give him all of our heart, all of our soul, and all of our mind. And the wise men did it. They showed it with their journey. They were willing to give up, months of their life, time, resources, to go out of their way to worship him. And even though, it's a bit extreme, I think, we need to find ways to worship him that way. Find ways to give ourselves entirely to Jesus. Because in that sense, we think about it like our heart is a throne. And God can either sit in our heart, or we can sit in our heart and be our own king. And we can't share it. You can't share a throne. Kings don't share power. And that's the kind of thing we think, see in the Bible, like you cannot serve two masters. We have to learn to serve God wholeheartedly, give him all of our heart, and recognize him as the whole king. And we can't try to hold on to a little bit of the throne. We have to give God everything in our life. Because if the wise men can travel 1,000 miles across the desert to worship an infant Jesus, then we should never have any excuses about coming to worship God, or coming to worship him, or having things laid in our life to worship him. They've given us an example to follow. And we come to worship him, we need to lay something down. We need to give something to God. Because worship is not only recognizing it, but it's laying something down, giving something. In the old temples, you'd always bring something to worship. You'd always bring a sacrifice or something to give to worship. Because a lot of people expect to come to worship and receive, come to get something out of worship. But the problem is with worship, you have to give to receive. You have to give something for God to work in you. You have to give something for God to be able to work in you and start working in your life. And that's how worship works, is giving to get. We must engage. We must give a gift. We must show our adoration. We must surrender the throne in our life to Jesus. Let him sit in the throne. That means turning everything over to him. If we let Jesus be the king, that means there's not going to be an area of life that he's not going to be holding on to. That's one part, I met some people that they have a hard time with Christianity, where they say, I like it, but I like having it as an add-on, on the side, if I can, pick and choose when to use it. But Jesus doesn't want that. He says, I want to be in control of your whole life. I want everything. Don't hold anything back from me. He wants all of us. And we see at the wise men, they were willing to give everything. They traveled. They gave him everything. And then we see Herod, who's scared of that, trying to give everything to another king, and how he reacts. And the thing is, when we give stuff to Jesus, he uses it. In this story, the gifts given to Jesus were used by his mother and father to help him flee Egypt. And in our life, the gifts we give to God, the things we give to God, will be used by him. The things we give to God, he will use. If we want God to work bigger ways in this kingdom, we need to find ways to give ourselves more to him, not just with our time, money, but with our hearts, with our souls, with our gifts, our abilities. We can give our whole life to God. And if we give our whole life to God, then God can use our whole life. And it kind of just keeps building from that. The more we give to God, the more He can use. The more He can use, the more we can give. And the thing is, there are people going to try to step in and stop God's story. They're going to try to stop God from working in their lives. And that's what Herod does. Herod tries to hold on to his throne. He tries to outwit God. He tries to outsmart the God who created the universe. God is creating the order. But that doesn't work. Because we can't hold on to a throne. No matter how tight we try to hold onto a throne or hold on to control our lives or hold on to something, God will work through that. He will loosen our grips. Because if we do not choose to worship Him, God will still work. Because God does not need for us to agree for Him to start working in our lives. He will start working. Because God wants us to surrender all to Him. Jesus is our King, and we need to lay everything at His feet, no matter what is in our way. And that's the thing I think beautiful about the story. In this story, we see Herod, who the obstacle in his way was his own pride, his own recognition that he needed to be king. And we also see the wise men, who had a physical obstacle in the way, just distance. But the wise men set their mind on Christ. They were able to overcome their obstacle. And I believe one thing about the story is if Herod would have just been a little more humble, would have been able to see the bigger picture, I believe Herod could have come and worshipped Jesus as the King of the Jews. If Herod would have been so focused on himself and keeping himself on the throne, he could have come and worshiped God. The only thing that was standing in his way was himself. Because God wants us to worship with an open heart and praise Him. And the wise men show us how we can come to God and worship and praise Him, and how the choice is out there. Herod chose wrong, the wise men chose right. And at the end of this, we look at this and we see these wise men and how far they're willing to go to worship God. And I think to myself, how far are we willing to go to worship Jesus? How far out of our way are we willing to go to seek Jesus in our life? Because a lot of times there are obstacles in our way, right? Sometimes there are obstacles that are put up there by other people, distance, time, situations. Some of them are put up by ourselves. We put up obstacles in our own life to not go and worship God. But the thing is, we cannot overcome these obstacles by ourselves. We need Christ too. But if we focus on Christ and say, I can go to Him, I just have to go through these obstacles, we can fight and we can overcome these obstacles. Like Paul says in the Corinthians, Romans, I am fighting for the prize. You look towards the prize, and the prize here is Christ. And if we look at that prize, nothing should be able to stand in our way. Run the race to win the prize. That's what Paul said to do. That's what we need to do. We need to fight for Christ and fight to worship Him and choose to worship Him. So that's my question, is how can we worship Jesus? Because the thing is that it's our choice to worship Him. All the things that Jesus has done, they're done. Like, He can't do anything more or less to prove his need for worship. He's already proven Himself worthy of worship. So what we have to do is choose. So the question is, what is standing in our way of worship this week? Is it something I put there, something that's been put there by someone else? Either way, we can overcome it through Christ. And as we're ending here, I just want to, and one final point is that Herod tried to hold on to his kingdom. He tried to hold on to himself. But Herod died. And then Herod's son took over. And Herod's son died. And Herod's grandson took over. And Herod's grandson died. And in the first century, the line of Herod is ended. And Herod's kingship goes no more. And Herod's attempt to squash the kingship of Jesus does not end. Or ends. But Jesus, He's the king. He comes, and in the first century, His kingdom starts. And He starts this new kingdom on earth. And 2,000 years later, His kingdom still stands. Because He is the king. And if we come to Him recognizing that He is the king, we will have victory. And we're coming to the end here. We're going to sing a closing song here, Victory in Jesus. And this song works perfectly because our victory is in Jesus, who is the king, who we need to come to worship. And when we come to worship Him, we're proclaiming His victory that has been done and is also yet to come. His victory is only half done. He's won the victory. He did that, died on the cross. But His victory, we still have more of the victory coming. So as we end here, let us worship Jesus by singing the song, Victory in Jesus. Please rise.